happy little games. It was a magical time growing up during the golden age of arcades. There was nothing more exciting than going to the arcade or bowling alley every week hoping there would be some new game to try out. I was also curious how these games would look on the Atari 2600 and Commodore 64. So when I started this channel, I wanted to include the various ports of the games I was covering. Some people like them, some people don't. So if you want to skip this video, by all means go ahead. Otherwise, pop some popcorn and grab the family because this is the queefiest episode in Patman QC history. These are the Conversions, Volume 1. Let's start off by taking a look at the one most people are familiar with, and that's the NES version. This game was so popular upon its release in America that it quickly sold over 1 million copies. Upon starting up the game, the beloved 2-player mode that was sorely missing in the first entry on the NES makes its triumphant return. Continuing the tradition of the first NES game, this one expands upon the arcade sequel, giving it much more depth. Various cutscenes unfold and do a great job of telling the story. Some of the moves have been changed, including the removal of the elbow and the spin kick. There are a couple of new attacks once you get your opponent in a grapple, such as an elbow smash and a powerful jumping kick. There are also a lot more platform elements this time around. The level design is much more varied, going from a military base to rooftops to fighting inside of a helicopter. Eventually, you will be transported to another dimension where you have to fight the mysterious warrior in the final battle. If you defeat him, an angel will descend from heaven and revive Mary. Thankfully, there is no slowdown, but there is a bit of flicker in the 2-player mode. They added a couple of different game modes, including Mode A, where you cannot do damage to the other player, and Mode B, where you can. As for the overall feel, everything is nice and tight.
That's what she said.
Let's take a look at the port that was released only in Japan, and that would be the PC Engine version. This was released on the Super CD format and is actually based upon the NES game as opposed to the arcade original. 2-player simultaneous co-op is also on tap, just like the NES game. Thanks to the huge storage space provided by the CD format, the cutscenes have been redrawn and are now animated. This works really well, and although everything is in Japanese, you really get a feel for the story. Although the gameplay is essentially the same as the NES version, the graphics have been redone and look fantastic. Sprites are nice and large with smooth animation for each of the characters. Thanks to the more powerful NEC hardware, the graphics look more like a combination of the arcade original and the NES Classic. The sound effects and music are extremely good with bone-crunching sound effects and heart-pounding techno music. The controls are nice and responsive, and any beat-em-up fan will feel right at home. It's just too bad this did not come out here in the States because I would have loved to have played it back in the day. Switching over to the 8-bit computer releases, let's take a look at the Amstrad version. This is nuts and twigs above the original version in just about every department. Control-wise, we are dealing with only one fire button, so as usual when it comes to the computer ports, sacrifices had to be made. The graphics were converted from the arcade game down to the Atari ST, and then down even lower to the Amstrad, but they look really good, especially considering the hardware. The sprites are nice and large, although the animation is just a bit choppy. The speed of the game is fairly good, running about 80 to 85% of its arcade big brother. The controls feel good, although an extra couple of fire buttons would have helped immensely. This is about as good as it can get on the humble Amstrad hardware. If you absolutely love the top and bottom black borders on your spiffy new widescreen HD TV, then be sure and check out the 48K version of Double Dragon 2 on the Spectrum. Due to the lower memory limitations, a tiny strip of screen shows the action and everything feels claustrophobic. Also completely missing from this version are the bosses, and there are only 2 types of bad guys to fight. The loading times on cassette are really bad as well, with the action breaking up multiple times on each level. To be fair, what is there of the graphics are nicely detailed and the speed of the game is very fast. The AI on the other hand is not very good. The 128K version improves the loading times and restores the bosses, but for some odd reason puts them at the middle of the stage instead of at the end. Also restored to its former glory is the full screen experience with hardly any slowdown in sight. Although it may just be in monochrome, it is a much better port than the original game, which was a turd of a conversion. Let's switch back over to a Nintendo system with a Game Boy release. Although the artwork is from Double Dragon 3, the game is nothing like number 2 or number 3. Unfortunately, it's just a reskin of one of Techno's Japanese Kunio-kun titles similar to what they did with the original Renegade. The controls are pretty straightforward with various punches and kicks at your disposal, including a super uppercut which knocks enemies all the way across the screen. Enemies will attack you with weapons and you are able to knock them out of their hands, but you cannot pick them up. There is simultaneous 2-player action thanks to the link cable. The gameplay isn't too bad, but since it was based on a different game, it doesn't quite feel like Double Dragon. The Atari ST version is up next, and it looks very close to the arcade original. The sprites are large and detailed, and the speed runs along at a quick pace. Considering how dreadful the conversions of the first game turned out, hopes were not high when this was released, but thankfully they did a great job. Yes, we only have one fire button, but everything from the arcade game has been retained aside from the opening animation of Marion getting shot. The sound effects and music are very good, although not quite as good as the Amiga port. Overall though, a stellar conversion for the 16-bit Atari. The MS-DOS version is available in CGA, EGA, and VGA modes, and looks-wise it competes quite nicely with the Atari ST and Amiga versions. Speed-wise, the game is very fast with nice responsive controls despite only having one fire button. The simultaneous 2-player mode has also been retained. As for the sound, you guessed it. Since this is an early MS-DOS title, all we get are the usual farts and queefs of the internal speaker. If you love Double Dragon 2 on the Spectrum but felt it was just way too advanced, then be sure to check out the MSX version. This is essentially the slower, choppier, crappier version of the 48K Spectrum port, which means you don't even get to experience the game in full screen. The controls are adequate and it does run along at a decent pace. There is also music while you play, which is always a big plus. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next, and compared to the first game, this one is a masterpiece. The sprites are large and detailed and easily recognizable from the arcade original. The animation is pretty smooth along with the gameplay itself. The hit detection though is not so great, with your punches and kicks seemingly going through the characters from time to time. Most of the arcade experience has been transferred over from the weapons to the elevators, and everything looks great. Not as good as the Amstrad version, but the animation and speed of the gameplay on the Commodore is a whole lot better. There is even music while we play, and even some digitized speech at the end of the game. Now let's take a look at the best 16-bit home computer port, and that is the Amiga version. For starters, the play area is full screen now with nary a black border in sight. The backgrounds along with the sprites appear to have been ripped straight from the arcade game, and they look fantastic. The animation is nice and smooth, and the speed of the game is darn near perfect. We get both excellent music and digitized sound effects at the same time, and yes, it sounds great. The only hindrance is the one-button controls, but overall it feels like the arcade version of Double Dragon 2. This was one of my favorite arcade conversions on the Amiga back in the day. The Mega Drive version was released only in Japan, and overall it just doesn't quite compete with the original conversion of the arcade game. All of the sprites have been scaled down quite a bit, and there's an obvious lack of color going on. We also get a wonderful black border at the bottom of the screen, which is supposed to help with the speed of the game, but it just doesn't work. Everything about the speed of the gameplay is just a bit off, as if there's a lag between button presses. The music and sound effects are nice, with some of the grunts and groans taken straight from the arcade game. The level layout is very close to the arcade original. We even get the opening animation where Marion gets shot, which a lot of these conversions didn't have. It's a pretty good port despite its flaws, and I would have been more than happy to play this on my Genesis back in the day. The BBC Micro version is up first in all of its neon-colored glory. Seriously now, they couldn't have come up with a better color scheme than this? I understand limitations on machines, but wouldn't the color red or brown be just a little bit better? I would rather look at the color of a turd than this neon mess. Getting past the colors, the screen uses a flick screen scrolling method unlike the smooth version found in the arcade. However, the game is fast and the animation is fairly smooth. Not a great conversion by any means, but it certainly is not the worst one either. The Commodore Plus 4 version is up next, and I wish it would crawl back under the rock in which it came from. And here you all thought that the BBC Micro version was the worst one. This seriously looks like it was written in BASIC with graphical glitches all throughout. There is only one sound in the game, and that is when you use your weapon. The screen uses the same flick screen scrolling that was found in the BBC Micro version. Rumor has it that this was Tiertex's first game, which would explain a lot. The game sort of resembles the arcade game, but that's after you've had 5 shots of vodka. I've said this before and I'll say it again. At least this game is fast, but so is my diarrhea. The Atari 800 version is up next, and boy oh boy, what do we have here? Your character appears to have 2 frames of animation and only 1 color. Your jumping ability makes it look like you are on the moon. The enemy soldiers appear to have stopped for a hit at the local crack house because they appear to be twice as fast as you. The backgrounds are nice, and honestly, that's about it. We do get some nice smooth scrolling, but the playability is just terrible. The enemies appear way too fast, giving you little time to react. I would avoid this at all costs. If you love herky-jerky scrolling with subpar animation, then the MSX version is right up your alley. This looks absolutely like a Spectrum port, but surprise, surprise, it's not. It's just a bad version of a classic arcade game. Single color sprites and slow, uninspiring gameplay makes this one of the worst ports of Green Beret. The animation is laughable, with the characters seeming to glide along the ground. There are a few sound effects here and there, but it's nothing to get excited about. The MS-DOS version is really well done despite only having 4-color CGA graphics. The entire arcade presentation is here, from the opening to the intermissions to the ending. The sprites are very detailed and look really close to the arcade original. The thing that lets it down is the slow and jerky scrolling. It's nowhere near as bad as the MSX version, but something is just a bit off. Since this is an early DOS game, the only sound support is the internal PC speaker, which, by the way, sounds terrible. The sound effects and music at the end of level 1 were literally hurting my ears. The playability, though, is very good with nice responsive controls. And now we have possibly the best 8-bit home computer conversion, which is the Commodore 64 version. The entire presentation from the arcade is included, but this time we get excellent music and sound effects. Although the graphics are just a tad bit blocky and not as detailed as the MS-DOS version, they are animated nicely with smooth scrolling all throughout. The controls are nice and tight, although you do have to press the spacebar to fire your secondary weapon. The difficulty is pretty high in this version, but all in all, it's an excellent conversion. If you were to look at still shots of the Amstrad version, you might think this would be the best home conversion. After watching this game run for just a few seconds, you will realize how wrong you were. While the colors are nice and the sprites are fairly detailed, the flick screen scrolling is just absolutely horrendous. It's possible for your character to get to the right of the screen and have to wait for the screen to finish scrolling. The speed of the game is about 75% of the original, which greatly hurts the playability. For some reason, the levels seem twice as long as in the arcade game. There is a decent little tune playing in the background, which always helps, but unfortunately, it doesn't help enough. Up next is the Spectrum version. First off, let's talk about the monochrome elephant in the room. Yes, the colors are severely limited and color clash has been kept to a minimum, but it looks really good, especially for a Spectrum game. According to David Collier, who was the original programmer on this game, Imagine Software gave them a deadline of 6 weeks to get this completed from start to finish. What they were able to accomplish in that short amount of time was phenomenal, since essentially everything from the arcade game is included except for music. Mr. Collier wanted to include music, but he said literally every byte of memory was taken. The speed of the game is fast and the scrolling is nice and smooth. A really good conversion on the humble Spectrum computer. The version most players are familiar with is the NES version. This takes the original arcade game and expands upon it by adding simultaneous 2-player action, extra levels, and a different plot. Not only do you get a brand new opening scene, but you also get a brand new ending as well. Instead of rescuing POWs, your mission is to destroy the enemy's secret weapon. The graphics are very detailed and are close representations of the arcade game. The speed of the game is on par with the original and the gameplay feels just right. Along with the sound effects and music, this is probably the best home conversion. In 2002, the Game Boy Advance received a compilation of games titled Konami's Collector Series Arcade Advance. This featured 6 arcade games, one of which was Green Beret. This version is extremely close to the arcade game with a few extras thrown in. If you input the Konami code, it unlocks the 2 extra stages from the NES version. There is also a simultaneous 2-player mode via link cable. Finally, the controls have been changed, so instead of pushing up the jump, you just have to press the A button. Overall, it's a really good remake of the arcade original. In 2007, for the Nintendo DS, Konami Classic Series Arcade Hits was released. Similar to the Game Boy Advance compilation, this one included the original untouched arcade version without any extras added to the gameplay. It does include scans of the instruction card and leaflets along with tips and tricks for the game. This version is really well done and again is extremely close to the arcade original. Speaking of the original arcade game, it was released on the Xbox Live Network in 2007. This is running under emulation, so what you are playing is essentially the arcade game. There is an optional mode which improves the graphics and gives you a remixed soundtrack. Although I'm an arcade purist, I really did enjoy the enhanced port of this game. Let's start this off with the Atari 2600 version. For a game running on 1977 technology, this isn't too bad, aside from the blue grass, that is. Not as many cherries on screen or golden apples, but what's there looks pretty good. The music and sound effects are very good, along with the controls. They are nice and tight, the way they should be. Up next is the Apple II version. Once again, we have an epidemic of bluegrass, and for some reason the golden apples look like golden tomatoes. Everything else looks really good, but the sound effects... Now, I've joked before about games sounding like flatulence, but seriously, listen to the apple fall and break and tell me what you think. It sounds like one of those short, squat diarrhea farts. Anyway, the game control's good, and that's all that matters. The MSX version starts out very well with a nice representation of the arcade game, including green grass. The sprites are fairly large and detailed, except the monsters look like radioactive baby chicks out for revenge. However, the opening song, which should last just a few seconds, plays the entire time. It's beyond annoying, especially if you're a fan of the arcade game. The controls are a bit too stiff in my opinion, and the speed of the game is just a bit too slow. The ColecoVision port is the one I had growing up as a kid, and it's a pretty good conversion. Looking very similar to the MSX release, but with faster gameplay. The sound effects and music are well done, and the controls feel just like the arcade game. Up next is the Atari XE version. They did a really good job of representing the arcade game. The sprites are nice and detailed, although the cherries seem a bit squished. The colors seem a bit drab as well. The speed of the game is very close to the arcade original, but the music could have been done better. The controls feel like the arcade game, which is always a good thing. Up next is the good old Commodore 64 version. The graphics are nice and colorful with detailed sprites. This is one of the few home versions that featured all of the cutscenes from the arcade game. Sound effects and music are spot on with good renditions of the original. The gameplay is nice and fast, making this one of the best 8-bit conversions on the market. The original Game Boy even got a version of Mr. Do, and it's really well done. The graphics have been modified due to the lack of color, but the compromises in no way hurt the gameplay. Everything stands out and is easily visible. Some of the music has been changed, which is a bit of a downer, but the gameplay is nice and fast. Well done. Up next, we have the Super Nintendo version. It's a bit odd that we never received an NES version, but we did receive one for the 16-bit console. This is a very close conversion, but also includes some extra options, including a battle mode, where two Mr. Doos can take on each other. This mode is very fun to play, so if you ever get a chance to try it, make sure you do. The graphics and animation are nice and smooth, along with excellent sound effects and music. The speed of the game is perfect, along with the gameplay. And finally, we have the X68000 version. As you would expect, this is a darn near perfect replica of the arcade game. The sound effects and music are identical, and the graphics are very close, if not arcade perfect. The Spectrum version is up first, and if you don't mind the color of your video games being that of the urine persuasion, then this game isn't too bad. The sprites are large and detailed, but the speed is about 75% of the arcade game. We do get a decent amount of sound, which is always a plus on the Spectrum. Another factor with all of the home computer ports is only one fire button as opposed to the 4 being used by the arcade game. This makes everything a bit tricky. However, this does play like the arcade game, and that's what's important. Another fine job by the sales curve. Up next is the Amstrad version. Although we get a nice amount of color this time around, everything else is very poor when compared to the Speccy. First off is the speed. It is horrendously slow regardless of how much action is happening on screen. There is also no sound, which greatly hurts the playability. Once the action gets wild and crazy, everything sort of mixes together in a series of pixelated explosions, making it hard to decipher what's happening on screen. Almost as if somebody threw up pixels all over the screen. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next, and as you can tell, it's very good. The first thing you notice is the excellent music found pumping out of your speakers. And while the graphics are a bit blocky, they are nicely animated and the speed is very fast. Almost a bit too fast when compared to the arcade game. Everything appears to be here, including the 2-player mode. The NES port is up next, and surprisingly, it's not censored much at all. The game was released by Acclaim and developed by Rare, so you know it's probably going to be pretty good. The first thing you notice that's missing are the digitized characters of the arcade game, having been replaced with traditional sprites. Everything has been shrunk down but moves along at a fairly good pace when compared to the arcade game. The characters are nicely animated, but the colors are a bit bland in my opinion. They also included the much beloved 2-player mode. The first of the 16-bit ports that we're looking at is the Atari ST version. The sprites are large and detailed with excellent animation all throughout. There are plenty of enemies on screen at once to kill, very similar to the arcade with hardly any change in the speed of the game. Everything from the arcade game appears to have been included, although the sampled sounds are a bit on the iffy side when compared to the Amiga. Once again though, you only have one fire button to contend with. And finally we have the Amiga version. This is the best of the 16-bit computer ports, and while it looks very similar to the Atari ST, the colors are a bit better along with slightly faster speed. The sound is greatly improved over the ST, with a nice range of explosions and gunfire. There is even a sampled intro on both 16-bit versions, although the Amiga version is much cleaner. The first one we're going to look at is the Spectrum version. Looking at it in still shots, it looks pretty good, with large detailed sprites. However, as soon as the game is put in motion, you'll see why this is one of the worst conversions ever. The hit detection is way off, and the speed is just too darn slow. Also, you only have one fire button as opposed to the arcade setup which uses 3. This also really hinders the gameplay. To be honest, the music on the title screen is very well done. If you thought the Spectrum version was just a bit slow, then wait till you get a load of the Amstrad version. Looking almost identical to the Spectrum, but with 1 or 2 extra colors and about 50% less in the speed department. Who in their right mind thought this was a good enough game to release? I wouldn't let my grandma play this game, and she has cataracts in both eyes. I would avoid this at all costs. Up next is the Super Nintendo version. When I was a young teen, I couldn't wait for this one to be released. The Genesis version was, and still is, one of my favorite versions of Pitfighter to play. So with the graphics being just a little bit better on the Super Nintendo, I thought this would be the ultimate version. Not. The fine scrubs at THQ are back doing what they do best, and that's screwing up arcade conversions. 95% of the speech is missing. 50% of your opponents are missing. All of the weapons are missing. And the final straw that broke the camel's back is you are only given 1 life with no continues. To be fair, the game is reasonably fast. The Sega Master System version is up next, and this is the only version that scrapped the digitized sprites, so everything is redrawn. It doesn't matter though, because the sprites have been shrunk by about 400%, meaning I had to go out and buy glasses just to play this game. You get to fight in a very sparse environment in front of a lifeless, dull crowd with absolutely no weapons. The game does have some decent music though. The good old Commodore 64 version is up next. The game retains the digitized style, but everything is a bit blocky, so they are hard to make out. The colors in the game are drab and dreary, which also doesn't help when it comes to items blending in. This version does feature almost all of the weapons, so there is that. The controls are just the same with only one fire button, which makes it really difficult to play. On the positive side though, the game moves along at a fairly decent pace with some excellent music. The MS-DOS version looks pretty good, but rather than try to emulate the scaling effect found in the Atari ST and Amiga version, they chose to vertically stretch the sprites, which makes everything look just a bit off. Only one fire button is used, but the speed is pretty close to the arcade game. Now, who in their right mind would have thought that the Game Boy version would be better than the 16-bit Super Nintendo version? Not me, folks, that's for sure. Now, I'm not saying this is a good version, but it is a lot better than the travesty that was found on the Super NES. The sprites are large and detailed, but with such huge characters, the speed has taken a bit of a bump. The game runs at about 75% of the arcade speed, meaning it's just not very fun to play. Up next is the absolute best port of Pitfighter running on a handheld, which is the Atari Lynx version. The reason this version is so good is because coder Al Baker had access to the arcade game source code, and was able to convert it line by line. The sprites are large and detailed and easily recognizable. Almost everything from the arcade game is here, including all of the weapons. One thing that wasn't included though was all of the digitized speech, and that was only because the developer ran out of space. The gameplay and speed is almost identical to the arcade game. The Atari ST version is up next, and while it's a decent effort, it falls just a bit short. The graphics are very good, and it even attempts to emulate the scaling effect found in the arcade game. What lets it down though is the one-button control scheme and also the lack of speed. It does have some pretty good music though. The Amiga version is up next, and all in all it looks pretty good. The scaling effect has been replicated to a certain degree, and the characters are large and easily recognizable. This game even features some of the digitized speech found in the arcade game. Unfortunately, we have one button to use, which really hinders the gameplay. The speed is fast, almost as fast as the arcade game. And finally, my absolute favorite version of Pitfighter to play, which is the Sega Genesis version. Rather than try to replicate the size of the sprites, they shrunk everything down but still retained the digitized quality. Something else that was retained was the awesome controls. This plays exactly like the arcade game. All of the weapons have been included, as well as the crowd interactions. Another big plus is that 99% of the digitized sounds and voices were included in this port. An absolute masterpiece if you are a fan of the arcade game. Is the MS-DOS port. Now let's get the bad out of the way first. If your colors of choice are pink and blue pastels, then this is right up your alley. While the graphics are fairly detailed, especially for a 1984 DOS game, the sound effects and music leave a lot to be desired. If you stick your fingers in your ears at just the right angle, it does sound just like the arcade game. Otherwise, you'll be treated to a series of bloops and bleeps which makes it sound like your computer is passing gas. Now that we've got the bad out of the way, what's left? Well, it is fast and fairly smooth in terms of animation and gameplay, but really that's about it. Up next is the Atari 2600 version, and all in all, it's a pretty good attempt. The game moves at a fast, frenetic pace, which perfectly captures the speed of the original. There are plenty of enemies on the road, and most of the features from the arcade game are included. The music and sound effects are pretty good, with a nice little attempt at the Peter Gunn theme included. One downside is that you have to use the other controller plugged into the second joystick port to select your weapons, due to the Atari only having one fire button. First impressions of the BBC Micro version are pretty good, but if you spend more than 30 seconds with it, you'll realize that looks can be deceiving. Everything moves along at a nice speed, and the graphics are detailed, although the palette is a bit garish. The sound effects and music are pretty good, with a nice rendition of the Peter Gunn theme. So what's the problem? There are hardly any enemies on the road. Rather than fight against the enemies, you end up fighting with the road as you try to stay on for any length of time. It feels like you're driving on glass. The Spectrum version is a decent attempt, although speed-wise it falls a bit short. The scrolling is a little too choppy, with the speed of the game running at about 75% of the arcade original. The sprites are large and detailed, with color clash kept to a bare minimum. The controls are responsive, with the ability to maneuver in and out of traffic with ease. There are lots of enemies on the road to take out, so you better be on your toes. There is no music, which is a bit of a shame, but there is rudimentary machine gun fire. You say you're looking for the worst conversion of Spy Hunter? I think we may have a winner. While on the surface the Apple II version does a decent job of replicating the arcade game's graphics, it all goes downhill once you see it in motion. The scrolling is too jittery, making it hard to maneuver around your enemies. There is very little snaking of the highway, when combined with the speed of the gameplay, makes this game just a bit too easy. The water sections have also been completely removed as well. How about the music? Nowhere to be found. The Amstrad version is up next, and while the graphics are nice and colorful, the speed of the gameplay really lets it down. The scrolling is very choppy, as well as making it hard to compensate when dealing with the enemies on screen. That is, if you can find any. Another thing you have to compensate for is the slippery as ice controls. There is also no music or sound to speak of, putting this near the top of the worst Spy Hunter conversions ever. The Atari 800 port is very well done aside from the limited color palette. The scrolling is very smooth and fast, almost as fast as the arcade original. There isn't as much traffic on the road as found in other versions, but that just makes it a little bit easier. The playability is top notch with your car being nice and responsive. The Peter Gunn theme is well represented along with very good sound effects. Overall, an excellent port. The good old Commodore 64 has one of the best ports of Spy Hunter. Looking very similar to the excellent Atari 800 version but with brighter visuals and more traffic on screen. The speed of the gameplay is top notch and the controls feel very similar to the arcade original. The sound effects and especially the Peter Gunn theme sounds great thanks to the wonderful SID chip. The ColecoVision port is another excellent conversion. The speed of the gameplay is very close to that of the arcade game with large sprites. The controls are nice and tight with plenty of on-screen enemies to contend with. The Peter Gunn theme sounds great, especially considering the hardware it's running on. As an added bonus, you can even use the Super Controllers with its extra buttons to control your weapons. Midway Arcade Hits was released for the Game Boy Color and featured 2 games, Moon Patrol and Spy Hunter. Spy Hunter is very well done, as it should be, considering the game was released 16 years after the arcade original. Detailed, colorful sprites and fast-moving gameplay makes this accurate in every way possible. Even the tiny Game Boy Color belts out a pretty good rendition of the Peter Gunn theme. The game was also released for the Game Boy Advance and is actually the best portable version of Spy Hunter not running under emulation. Everything looks very close to the original arcade game from the colors to the speed of the gameplay. The sound effects and music are very faithful to the original arcade game. Upon first glance, you would think this was the actual arcade game. And finally, we have the NES version. This game appears to be running way too fast, making split-second decisions even more difficult. The graphics are well done, although not quite as colorful as other versions. There are plenty of enemies on screen at once with nary a slowdown in sight. Sound effects and music are very good. The first version we are looking at is the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive version. One thing the Sega Genesis version had that the arcade version did not was parallax scrolling. Just look at those multi-tiered background scrolls. Yummy! Due to it being the original pack-in for Sega's 16-bit system, the popularity of this game soared. Looking very close to its arcade counterpart, this shows what a 16-bit powerhouse could do. The difficulty was increased just a bit, but it played exactly like the arcade game, and that's what counts. We go from the highest of the highs to the lowest of the lows, and looking at this, you can't go any lower. There are some games that shouldn't be converted, and this is one of those games. With a frame rate that never manages to break double digits, I've seen better animation in a flipbook. But at least it's nice and colorful. How is the playability, you ask? Non-existent. Up next is the Atari ST version. While not bad, it's not very good either. Most of the home computer ports have a status bar at the very bottom of the screen, which I assume was to help with the speed of the scrolling. The controls are sluggish and the hit detection is a bit iffy. The colors are muted and so are the sound effects and music. On second thought, maybe this is a bad conversion. Up next is a PC Engine version, and while it's a good attempt, it doesn't come anywhere close to the quality of the Mega Drive version. First off, all of the voices are missing and the music is a bit iffy. They did, however, release a CD version which featured all of the voices, all of the music, and even cutscenes. The playability on this port is only average at best. next up is the Famicom release of Altered Beast. Take a quick gander at this game for a few seconds and take a guess as to why this game was Japanese only. Ding 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 ding. That's right, the game was so horrible they couldn't release it in North America or Europe. I haven't seen anything this small since I went to the bathroom. To be fair though, it does play pretty well for an 8-bit Famicom game, and the speed is pretty consistent with the arcade game. Sticking with the 8-bits is the Sega Master System version. While graphically superior to the Famicom version, speed-wise and control-wise, it definitely is not. The sound effects and music are pretty good. The third level is missing entirely, and so is the Beast transformation. Up next is the favorite computer of my youth, the Amiga 500 version. While it is a bit on the slow side compared to the Atari ST version, the music and sound effects are nice, even retaining a lot of the voices from the original arcade game. The controls are nice, even with only one fire button. Up next is the MSX version, and I really wish it wasn't. For those of you who don't know, the MSX was a little seen computer, and frankly, I wish I'd seen even less of it. Holy moly, is this game slow. You can count the colors on one hand. That is, if you had fingers. The controls are sluggish and unresponsive, but hey, at least there's a nice jingle playing in the background. Trusty but perhaps rusty Commodore 64 version is up next. This is the best of the 8-bit computer ports, but that's not saying very much. The controls are nice and responsive, and the speed of the gameplay is very close to the arcade game. While the graphics are a decent size, the colors are dull and dreary. We do get some excellent music thanks to the Commodore 64 SID chip. The Specky port closes out the 8-bit computer ports with a pretty good conversion. Yes, there's a bit of color clash going on, but it is fast and plays like Altered Beast, even with only one fire button. The speed of the game is pretty consistent with its arcade big brother. Finally, the last one we are looking at is the MS-DOS version. This one was developed by DSi, whereas all of the other versions were done by Activision, and it really shows. The first thing you notice that is missing is the giant status bar at the bottom. Also, we get large detailed sprites, pretty good music, and the only version to feature full-screen Beast transformations. The playability is very good. The home version most people are familiar with is the NES version. To pad out the game, additional content was added in the forms of more varied enemies and gameplay. There are now even large warriors who use clubs instead of guns, elite soldiers, and also robots. Even the mini-bosses at the end are completely different or in the wrong order. Instead of one long continuous stage, The game is split up into 4 separate ones, but these are all extremely long. The game is even more difficult than its arcade big brother thanks to its limited controls. There are still plenty of enemies and bullets are flying, so again, you have to be on your toes. Along with being able to drive the tank, you also get to fly the helicopter, which lets you use the machine gun to cut up your enemies like Swiss cheese. The only downside to this is that the helicopter will eventually run out of gas and crash with no way of being able to exit once you are in. The graphics are simply adequate with murky colors and limited sound effects and music. Back in the day, I enjoyed this one. Nowadays, not so much. Now let's take a look at the beautiful, stupendous, absolutely gorgeous... I'm sorry. Even I can only polish a turd so much. The Atari 2600 version is absolutely terrible. Possibly the worst arcade conversion ever. Considering this game came out in 1990, a full 13 years after the system launched, it's understandable why this version would look so bad. What's not understandable is why the people at Atari would continue to suck the unit dry, even though a competent conversion could never be accomplished on this hardware. The sprites are an ugly, discombobulated mess. When you kill an enemy or blow up a building, they just disappear as if they were a ghost. The scrolling is smooth, which is about the only positive thing I could find in this game. A variation, and I use that term loosely, of the theme song plays in the background, but of course it doesn't sound great. You can only move vertical and horizontal in the tanks and not diagonally, which you could do in the arcade version. Also, when your tank is hit, it just disappears, not even giving you a chance to escape. To top things off, there are no power-up icons either. If the name of your game is pain, then this is the game for you. Sticking with the Atari line, let's take a look at the 7800 version. This was released on aging hardware that was developed in 1983, although it wouldn't see a worldwide release until 1986. Despite these limitations, this is an excellent conversion and a whole lot better than the 2600 fiasco. The game opens up with the arcade attract animation, and we even get 2-player simultaneous action. The graphics and animation, while not quite as sharp as its NES counterpart, still look good with nice vibrant colors. The music is just there, which is about all I can say for it. It's not bad, but there are only 2 tracks in the game, one being the title screen music and the other which plays all throughout the game on a loop. The controls are much better than the 2600 version, allowing your character to move diagonally and also shoot in different directions while moving. Even the tanks can roll along diagonally. The collision detection is a bit iffy though, especially when trying to enter the tanks. This game more faithfully replicates the arcade level layout than the NES version, so arcade purists will absolutely love this version. The good old Commodore 64 received not one but 2 conversions of this classic arcade game. Let's take a look at the one released for the USA market. This one is not very good. The graphics and animation are not very detailed, with your character having blue hair instead of black. Also, when you die, every enemy, tank, and cannon that's on the screen will die and get destroyed as well. The game moves along at a fairly decent pace, but sometimes there is a ton of flicker on the screen. There is no two-player simultaneous mode, along with totally different stage layouts from the arcade game. The hit detection is not good either, especially with the grenades. Thankfully, a short time later, something much better would come along. A few months later, the game was released by Elite in Europe for the Commodore 64. This is a brand new conversion built from the ground up. The first thing you notice when you boot the game up is that it has the original arcade opening if you're playing Crashing in the Jungle. The graphics look a whole lot better, although the sprites are smaller in scale than the USA version. The animation is also well done and a big step up from the previous game. The sound effects and music are put to good use, with the Sid ship belting out a good rendition of the arcade's theme song. There doesn't appear to be any flicker in this game as well, which is always a good thing. The controls feel fantastic and are nice and responsive. The horrible collision detection that was present in the USA version is much better in this one. Overall, every category is a big step up from its USA counterpart. Sticking with the Commodore line, let's check out the Commodore 16 version. The graphics, while a bit on the blocky side, are fairly detailed, but the problem comes with the colors. They are extremely dull and drab. The animation is smooth along with the scrolling, which makes for a better gameplay experience. There is no music, although we do have sound effects, which are absolutely eardrum piercing after a short time of playing. The controls are responsive, but you can only fire up and not necessarily in the direction you are facing. Although it's not a good conversion as we've seen before, it's not the worst one either. Let's take a look at the MSX2 version. The graphics are nice and detailed with colorful sprites all throughout. The animation is a little ropey, especially when there are lots of enemies on the screen. Speaking of enemies, they don't disappear when you kill them, they just lay on the ground until the screen is littered with bodies. There is music while you play, and the sound effects are pretty good, including some digitized grunts and groans, especially when you die. The speed of the game isn't bad, but it's not quite arcade perfect. The controls are decent except for the hit detection being just a bit off. I would have been perfectly happy to play this on my home computer back in the day. The ZX Spectrum version is up next, and when this was released it received high marks across the board. The speed of the game is really quick and it flows quite nicely. The color clash has been kept to a minimum, although the sprites are monochrome. The graphics are detailed with smooth animation. We also get good sound effects as well. The controls are nice and tight and it feels like the arcade game. This is really well done, especially considering the hardware it's running on. Now let's check out the Amstrad version. The graphics are fairly detailed and so is the animation. The scrolling is not quite as smooth as the Spectrum version, but having that nice blast of color sure does help. We even get sound effects and music and they both sound terrific. The speed of the game is on par with the arcade original. The controls are very responsive and you will be blowing up the enemies with ease. This is a very good conversion, and if you are an Amstrad fan, you should check it out. The Atari ST version is the first of the 16 bits we are going to look at. The graphics are nice and detailed with the character sprites immediately being recognizable. The animation is also nice and smooth, although there is some slowdown when a lot of action appears on the screen. We get the arcade attract screen and the intro, so this really does feel like the arcade game thanks to the presentation. You even have the option for simultaneous two-player action. The music is pretty good with a nice rendition of the arcade tune playing in the background. The controls are responsive, although there is no way they can replicate the rotating joystick. Overall though, it's a really good conversion. The Amiga version looks very similar to the Atari ST, but with slightly smoother scrolling and faster gameplay. The sprites are nicely detailed with smooth animation. Similar to the Atari ST, we get the arcade attract screens and also the intro with your plane crashing in the jungle. The music is excellent and a big step up from the Atari ST version. Two-player simultaneous action is also available, so you and a friend can blast the night away. The controls feel good despite not having that rotating joystick. This is one of the best home conversions that is not running under emulation. The MS-DOS version is up next, and despite it being an EGA title, it looks pretty good. That is, until it starts to move. The arcade gameplay is a bit on the slow side, but this one is twice as bad. It seems as if everything is moving at a snail's pace. While the sprites are fairly detailed, everything takes place in a windowed box, which limits the amount of play area you have. There are also only 4 enemies on the screen at once. Now, what about the sound? I don't know how else to say it, but it's farts and queefs all over again. Maybe I should expand my vocabulary. Bloops and bleeps are exactly what you get, so if I were you, I would shut the sound off in the options. Control-wise, it's not bad, but the slow gameplay really hurts it in my opinion. There is a 2-player option, so at least it has that going for it. And there you have it, folks, the Conversions Volume 1. I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed making it. My next video is either going to be Mega Man Part 5 or something else entirely new. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, please click the link below. Thank you all so much for watching.